Hi everyone, welcome to video 2. We're going to be talking about contractions. So what are contractions? Contractions are when you take two separate words and you put them together. But you always take out a part of the word and put in an apostrophe. So instead of I will, it's I'll. Instead of you would, it's you'd. Instead of she will, she'll. Instead of we are, we're. Okay? So what do contractions do? They show pronunciation. They show how we actually pronounce the words. They remove sounds and letters, and then they use apostrophes. This is the apostrophe right down here, to show when sounds or letters have been removed. They are used in informal writing, so not professional or academic writing. If you're writing a job application, do not use contractions. If you're writing for a college professor, do not use contractions. In fact, you never have to use contractions at all. So if it's something that makes you nervous, don't worry, don't use them. But you do need to be able to recognize them when you read so that you can understand, okay? So the last point is they're optional. So let's take a look. When I lived in England, I would ride my bicycle to school. So we already talked about would and the verb, meaning that it's a habit or routine in the past. Okay, so every day or most of the time, usually, often, I would ride my bike to school. Now, most native speakers, when they're speaking, would not say, I would ride. They would take out this sound here, and they'd make this sound, I'd ride my bicycle to school. So sometimes when you're writing, especially if you're writing speech, you're writing a conversation and you want it to be realistic, you can use a contraction with an apostrophe. So you take out W-O-U-L and you just put an apostrophe in its place. I'd ride my bicycle to school. We can do it with you. When you lived in Texas, you would wear t-shirts every day. Okay, you don't live in Texas anymore. You live in Michigan. But in the past, when you lived in Texas, you had a habit of wearing t-shirts every day. Why? Because it's hot. Okay, so I could say you'd wear t-shirts every day. And there's my apostrophe. My grandmother lived through World War II. During the war, so in the past, she would go to dances with American servicemen. It was very exciting to my grandmother and her sisters, who lived in a very small village. Nothing exciting happened, right? Then the war came, and there were all these handsome young American men who wanted to dance with the English girls. Very exciting. So she would go to dances, but I could write it with a contraction. She'd go to dances with American servicemen. I can do it with we. When we were students, we would smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. Goodness, terrible habit. Okay, we'd smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. We'd. Same pronunciation as a plant that grows in your garden where you don't like it. A weed. And finally, they. When they worked in the bakery, they would often take leftover cakes and cookies home. So here we have would take, and we have the adverb often, because it's a habit, routine in the past. And I can use a contraction with they and would. They'd often take leftover cakes and cookies home. Now, often, you can pronounce often or often. Doesn't matter. Either way is completely fine. So you could say they'd often or they'd often take leftover cakes and cookies home. Great. So let's practice one more time. Let's go down here and we'll practice 3 times. So speak aloud with me. I'd. You'd. you'd, she'd, 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 he'd, 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 we'd, 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 they'd, they'd, they'd. Excellent. So let's practice reading aloud the story, the towel story. I've put in some contractions now, so it's more like real conversation. And I'd like you to read aloud with me. Okay, here we go. When I was young, my mother would get me into trouble all the time. This was because when I'd go for a shower, I'd always leave the wet towel on the floor behind me. My mother would go crazy, and she'd chase me around the house and tell me to pick the towel up. I'd always be in a bad mood afterward, and I'd always stamp my feet. I was a typical teenager. All right, good job. Now you might notice we make contractions with the pronouns, okay? You can say my mother'd, but it sounds a little bit strange. So usually we contract with pronouns. I'd, you'd, he'd, she'd, we'd, they'd. Those are the words we'd normally contract in conversation. And how do you know that this D is would? It could be had. How do you know? Well, I know this is would because this is the regular form of the verb. This is just the basic simple form of the verb go. So would plus the base form is going to give me habits in the past. Okay? All right, so why are we talking about this? Do you remember our reading? Do you remember Carson Palmer? This is Carson Palmer, real picture. He's a football player and he used virtual reality goggles to practice. So read along with me. Carson Palmer is one of the earliest adopters. That means he used the virtual reality first. Virtual reality, VR, gave him a tool he could use to learn the plays, that's like the routines, better. Carson had a virtual reality, a VR system in his home. Oops. Do you see my mistake there? I wrote the number 4. This should be for, F-O-R, the preposition. For just a couple of minutes a day, after he'd wake up, he'd go over his plays and mentally practice what he was going to do. So here we have he'd. He would wake up. He would go over his plays. It was a routine and a habit because he used the virtual reality every day to improve and to practice. That was a habit that he had when he was preparing for a game. So there it is in the book. Hopefully now we're reading it again. It makes more sense to you. Couple of things before we go. Do you ever have to use would and the verb? No. You need to recognize it and understand it. Okay? There are some other options though. If you want to talk about a habit in the past, you could say, when I was a child, I would walk to school. Okay, that's what we practiced. Would plus the verb. Or you can use simple past. When I was a child, I walked to school. And if you want to tell us it's a habit or routine, just add an adverb, like every day or always. I always walk to school. I walk to school every day. Those extra words will tell us that it was a habit. Or you can use used to. When I was a child, I used to walk to school. And we can have another lesson about used to if you guys think that would be helpful. Well, that's all from me. I will see you very soon in class, and I'm excited to read your little stories on the discussion board. Thanks for joining me today. Bye.